The empty chair. Lucas stood by the living room window, a knot tightening in his stomach with each passing minute. The late afternoon sun, usually a cheerful splash of gold across the carpet, felt muted, its warmth barely penetrating the pane. He'd polished the glass just this morning, a nervous habit, convinced that a clearer view would somehow hasten Daniel's arrival. The street below was quiet, save for a lone robin pecking at an errant worm in Mrs. Henderson's pristine lawn. No bus. Not yet. He checked his watch for the 10th time in as many minutes. It was almost 4:30. The bus was due at 4:15. Not a significant delay, not really, but enough to set his nerves jangling. He imagined Daniel, perhaps staring out a similar window, equally impatient or maybe lost in thought, the distant hum of the engine a monotonous drone. Lucas worried. He always worried, especially where Daniel was concerned. A faint memory surfaced, a flicker of summer heat and the scent of freshly cut grass. He was 6, Daniel 7, and they were constructing an elaborate fort in Lucas's backyard, an architectural marvel of discarded bedsheets and patio furniture. Daniel, ever the leader, had declared it impenetrable, a fortress against all imaginary foes. Lucas, the loyal lieutenant, had simply nodded, trusting Daniel's judgment implicitly. Daniel had always possessed a certainty, a spark, that Lucas admired. Even then there was an intensity about him, a fierce focus that set him apart. Later, as teenagers, their battleground had shifted from the backyard to the digital realms of video games, fueled by endless bags of chips and lukewarm soda. Daniel, with a glint in his eye, would strategize their attacks, his fingers flying across the controller with an almost surgical precision. Lucas, a little slower but just as determined, would follow his lead, their synchronized movements a testament to years of shared understanding. Their triumphs were always shared, their defeats softened by mutual commiseration. Even then, Lucas had felt a pull towards Daniel, a sense of belonging that was both comforting and exhilarating. He sighed, the memory dissolving back into the quiet of the room. So much had changed since those days. The easy laughter, the carefree spirit, it had all been replaced by something heavier, something Lucas couldn't quite grasp from their infrequent phone calls. Daniel's voice, once bright and full of a restless energy, had become flatter, tinged with an underlying weariness. He rarely spoke of his time overseas, brushing off questions with vague reassurances that only fueled Lucas's unease. The war had etched lines on Daniel's face that weren't there before, not just the physical ones of age, but deeper invisible scars that Lucas feared. The aroma of slow-cooked pot roast wafted from the kitchen, a comforting scent, but it did little to ease the tightness in Lucas's chest. He'd prepared Daniel's favourite meal, hoping the familiarity would offer some small solace. He'd even bought a fresh loaf of sourdough from the bakery down the street, knowing Daniel's fondness for the crusty bread. Everything was ready. All that was missing was Daniel. A larger bus, not the regional one Daniel would be on, rumbled past, shaking the window pane faintly. Lucas's heart gave a hopeful lurch before settling back into its anxious rhythm. He tried to rationalise. Traffic, a minor mechanical issue, anything to explain the delay. But a colder, more insidious thought kept creeping in. What if Daniel had changed his mind? What if the thought of returning, of facing the life he'd left behind, was too much? He pictured the dinner table, set for two, the blue placemats, the polished silverware, the carefully folded napkins, and then the empty chair, the one opposite his own, where Daniel would sit. A hollow ache bloomed in Lucas's chest. That chair, usually occupied by a mountain of laundry or a stack of books, had felt different all day, imbued with a quiet expectation. Now it just looked empty. A stark reminder of Daniel's absence and of the void he had left when he'd first left for the army. He remembered a particularly boisterous dinner years ago when Daniel had spilled an entire glass of milk, sending Lucas into fits of laughter. Daniel, red-faced but grinning, had joined in, their shared mirth echoing through the small house. Lucas missed that laughter. He missed the easy camaraderie, the unspoken understanding that had always existed between them. A sudden, sharp, braking sound from down the street shattered the quiet. Lucas's head snapped up, his gaze fixed on the corner. A large grey bus, its destination sign unreadable from this distance, slowly pulled into view. It wasn't the same colour as the regional line, but hope, bright and fierce, surged through him. He watched, breath held as the bus slowed, then hissed to a stop at the designated pull-off. The doors folded open. Lucas felt a tremor run through him, a mix of exhilaration and dread. He was about to see Daniel, his best friend, the boy who'd built forts and conquered virtual worlds by his side, but also a man who had faced unimaginable horrors, a man who was returning changed. He gripped the windowsill, knuckles white, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The empty chair wouldn't be empty for much longer. He just hoped he was ready for who would fill it. A familiar hug. The rumble of a distant engine slowly intensified, pulling Lucas from his anxious reverie. Headlights, yellowed by the fine dust stirred up from the road, cut through the deepening twilight. The bus, an older model with streaks of grime clinging to its windows, groaned to a halt. Its air brakes hissed, a sigh of release that mirrored the one catching in Lucas's throat. The bus door folded inward with a metallic clang, revealing a silhouetted figure in the opening. Lucas's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anticipation and dread. He squinted, trying to discern the familiar lines of his friend, but the interior of the bus was a cavern of shadows. Then a duffel bag, worn and faded, appeared, followed by a pair of scuffed military boots. Daniel stepped down, his movements a little stiff, a little slower than Lucas remembered. He was thinner, his uniform hanging loosely on his frame, and the boyish softness of his face had been replaced by a sharper, almost angular quality. A faint stubble shadowed his jaw, and there were faint smudges beneath his eyes, remnants of countless sleepless nights. But then Daniel's gaze met Lucas's, and a tired smile, hesitant at first, bloomed across his face. It was the same smile, a little crooked, a little shy, that Lucas had known since they were kids. "Lucas!" Daniel's voice was hoarse, a whisper against the hum of the idling bus engine. Lucas didn't respond with words. He surged forward, crossing the short distance between them in a blur. His arms wrapped around Daniel's shoulders, pulling him into an embrace that was both desperate and relieved. Daniel stiffened for a fraction of a second, a fleeting tension in his muscles, before his own arms came up, circling Lucas's back, holding on with a surprising strength. Lucas buried his face in Daniel's shoulder, inhaling the faint metallic scent of the uniform, mingled with something else, something earthy and foreign, like dry dust and distant fires. The hug lasted for what felt like eternity, a silent conversation of shared history and unspoken fears. Lucas felt the lean hardness of Daniel's body against his, a stark contrast to the familiar comfort of his friend's embrace. It wasn't the same Daniel who had left, but the essence, the core of him, was still there, clinging to Lucas as if he were a lifeline. When they finally pulled apart, Daniel's eyes were still a little wary, but the smile had deepened, a genuine warmth radiating from them. "Good to see you, man," Daniel said, his voice a little stronger now, though still gravelly. "You too," Lucas managed, his own voice thick with emotion. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "Let's get your bag." The bus driver, a stoic woman with a neatly tied scarf, gave them a brief nod as Lucas retrieved Daniel's duffel from the luggage compartment. The bag was heavier than Lucas expected, filled with the weight of unseen experiences. The drive home was quiet. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape, his face illuminated intermittently by the streetlights. Lucas stole glances at him, trying to decipher the unreadable expression. Daniel rarely spoke, offering only short, clipped answers to Lucas's attempts at conversation. He mentioned the flight, the long layovers, the sheer exhaustion of travel. He didn't elaborate and Lucas didn't push. He understood. There would be time. The silence in the car wasn't entirely uncomfortable, though it hummed with an undercurrent of unspoken questions and raw anticipation. Lucas felt a strange mix of joy and trepidation. Daniel was home. But the man beside him was a stranger in familiar clothes, a ghost of the boy he knew, and Lucas knew, with a chilling certainty that their journey together was just beginning. The empty chair at the table awaited, no longer empty, but filled with a presence that felt both comforting and profoundly new. The first scream. The oppressive silence of their shared apartment, usually a comfort, now felt like a taut string vibrating with unspoken tension. Lucas had watched Daniel drift off on the worn sofa, a blanket tucked awkwardly around him, the exhaustion a heavy cloak. Sleep for Lucas was a fitful thing. Every creak of the old building, every distant siren, pulled him back from the precipice of slumber. His senses hyper-alert, listening for... he wasn't sure what, just listening. It was sometime after midnight when the sound tore through the quiet, a raw, guttural cry that ripped Lucas from his sleep with the force of a physical blow. He shot upright in bed, heart hammering against his ribs, a cold dread seizing him. It wasn't a shout of anger, nor one of pain from a physical injury, but something far more primal. A sound wrenched from the deepest well of terror. "Daniel!" Lucas scrambled out of bed, his feet tangling in the sheets, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He burst into the living room, the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the window, casting long, dancing shadows. Daniel was sitting bolt upright on the sofa, his chest heaving, hands clawing at the fabric of his shirt as if trying to tear something away. His eyes, wide and unfocused, darted around the room, seeing things that weren't there. Sweat plastered strands of dark hair to his forehead. "Daniel, it's me. Lucas," he said, his voice a low, steady murmur trying to cut through the nightmare's lingering grip. He knelt beside the sofa, not daring to touch him yet, wary of startling him further. "You're home. You're safe." Slowly, agonizingly, Daniel's gaze locked onto Lucas. The terror in his eyes didn't vanish instantly, but it began to recede, replaced by a dawning recognition, then a profound, aching vulnerability. His hands dropped from his chest, trembling. "Lucas," he breathed, the word a ragged whisper, a gasp for air. Lucas reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently placed it on Daniel's shoulder. The muscle beneath his palm was rigid, trembling. "Bad dream?" he asked, though the question felt inadequate, almost insulting, given the intensity of the scream. Daniel nodded, unable to speak, his chest still heaving with residual fear. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again, trying to shake off the lingering images. Lucas watched him, a knot of grief tightening in his own stomach. This wasn't the Daniel he remembered, the one who'd laugh off a nightmare with a joke. This was a man haunted, a soldier still fighting battles in his sleep. "Come on," Lucas said softly, his voice imbued with a quiet determination. "Let's get you some tea. Something warm." He helped Daniel rise, supporting him as his legs felt unsteady. Daniel leaned into him for a moment, the unexpected weight of his friend's body a stark reminder of his fragility. The contact was brief, almost imperceptible, yet it lingered, a phantom warmth where their bodies had touched. They moved into the small kitchen, the refrigerator's hum the only sound. Lucas put the kettle on, the rhythmic clink of ceramic mugs a small comfort in the vastness of the night. Daniel sat at the table, his head in his hands, staring blankly at the worn wood. "You want to talk about it?" Lucas asked, pouring the steaming water over the tea bags. He didn't push, just offered the space. Daniel shook his head, a weary gesture. "Just shadows. Noise. I couldn't get away." His voice was raspy, laced with a tremor. Lucas carried the mugs to the table, placing one in front of Daniel. The warmth radiated through the ceramic, a small anchor in the cold, dark hours. He sat opposite him, not pressing for details, just being there. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the occasional clink of Daniel's mug as he lifted it, and the soft tick of the old wall clock. As the first hint of pre-dawn grey lightened the sky outside the window, painting the edges of the curtains with a pale sheen, Daniel finally spoke again, his voice softer now, less raw. "Thanks, Lucas." Lucas reached across the table, his hand finding Daniel's and gently squeezing. Daniel's skin was cool, but the tremor was gone. "Any time, Dee. Always." The morning light, when it finally arrived, found them still at the kitchen table, their mugs empty, the nightmare's sharp edges blunted by the passage of time and the quiet comfort of shared presence. The scream still echoed in Lucas's memory, a chilling testament to the wounds Daniel carried, but for now, the immediate crisis had passed. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was just the beginning. Shadows in the night. The days blurred into weeks, each one a carbon copy of the last, marked by a growing sense of dread as dusk approached. Daniel's panic attacks, once an occasional terror, had become a nightly ritual. Lucas learned to anticipate them, the subtle shift in Daniel's breathing from the living room couch, the almost imperceptible tremor that would precede the guttural cry. He'd wake to it, a cold knot forming in his stomach, and make his way to the living room, a silent sentinel in the dark. At first, Daniel would be huddled on the couch, knees drawn to his chest, eyes wide and unfocused, staring at something only he could see. Lucas would sit beside him, offering quiet comfort, a hand on his shoulder that Daniel would eventually lean into. But as the weeks wore on, the distance between them began to close. One night, after a particularly violent episode that left Daniel gasping for air, slick with sweat, he didn't return to the couch. Instead, he simply stood at the foot of Lucas's bed, a spectral figure in the moonlight filtering through the window. Lucas, already awake from the residual tremor of Daniel's fear, sat up, his heart thrumming a slow, anxious beat. "Daniel?" he whispered, his voice thick with sleep and concern. Daniel didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent plea in his posture. He looked smaller, more fragile than Lucas had ever seen him. The soldier Lucas knew, the one who'd laughed loud and punched harder, was gone, replaced by this haunted shadow. Without a word, Lucas shifted, making space on the mattress. Daniel moved then, slowly, deliberately, as if each step was a monumental effort. He lay down on the far edge, his back to Lucas, rigid and unmoving. Lucas lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the shallow, rapid breaths of his best friend. He didn't reach out, sensing that even the slightest touch might shatter the fragile peace. But the unspoken request for proximity had been made, and Lucas understood. It was a small, almost imperceptible shift, but it felt monumental. From then on, the couch remained empty. Daniel would, without fail, find his way to Lucas's bed after his nightmares. Sometimes he'd just lie there, a stiff, unyielding presence. Other times the tremors would continue, and Lucas would feel the faint vibrations against his own body. He learned to recognize the subtle cues, the way Daniel's shoulders would slump slightly after a particularly bad dream, the faint smell of cold sweat that clung to him, the almost imperceptible clenching of his jaw. Lucas's sleep became a patchwork of fragmented dreams and anxious awakenings. He'd wake to Daniel's sharp intake of breath, to the soft whimpers that escaped his lips before he'd fully surfaced. He'd watch Daniel's face in the dim light, contorted by unseen horrors, and a deep ache would settle in his chest. He felt a growing responsibility, a quiet understanding that he was Daniel's anchor, the one steady point in a world that had become a terrifying, shifting landscape for his friend. One morning, Lucas woke to find Daniel's hand resting lightly on his arm. It wasn't a conscious touch, more a byproduct of sleep, a seeking of warmth in the cool, morning air. But it lingered, a feather-light weight that sent an unexpected jolt through Lucas. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched Daniel's sleeping face, the lines of fear softened by slumber, and wondered what this new closeness meant for them both. The line between friend and something more felt thinner than ever, a delicate thread stretched taut in the quiet of their shared bedroom. The nights were long, the days a blur, and the unspoken questions between them grew with each sunrise. A lingering touch. The January night air, usually crisp and biting, felt like a physical weight that pressed down on Lucas as he lay beside Daniel. A low growl of wind rattled the window pane, a constant reminder of the chill that seeped into their small apartment. Lucas had been drifting, caught in that shallow space between sleep and wakefulness, a byproduct of the constant vigilance he maintained over Daniel. Then a sharp, guttural sound tore through the quiet, pulling him fully awake. Daniel was shaking. Not the subtle tremor Lucas had become accustomed to, but a violent, full-body shudder that made the mattress vibrate beneath them. His breath hitched, a ragged gasp tearing at the air. Lucas didn't need to ask. He knew it was another nightmare, a fresh horror unspooling in Daniel's mind. His skin was slick with cold sweat, yet his teeth chattered uncontrollably, a raw, primal response to terror and the unforgiving cold that seemed to amplify his distress. Without a second thought, Lucas rolled onto his side, facing Daniel. The darkness in the room was absolute, but Lucas could feel the frantic energy radiating from him, the palpable fear. He reached out, his hand instinctively finding Daniel's shoulder. Daniel flinched, a jolt running through his tense frame, but he didn't pull away. Lucas's fingers moved, a silent command, urging him closer. "Dan," Lucas whispered, his voice a low, steady rumble in the oppressive silence. "You're safe. It's just me." Daniel's shivering intensified, and a whimper, small and vulnerable, escaped his lips. Lucas's heart ached with a familiar pang of helplessness, but he knew what to do. He remembered the few times Daniel had allowed himself to be held as a child after a particularly bad fall or a schoolyard fight. It was always a tight, protective embrace, a silent promise of security. Lucas didn't hesitate. He pulled Daniel into his arms, a deep, encompassing hug that sought to absorb the tremors and the terror. Daniel was stiff at first, rigid and unresponsive, like a soldier bracing for impact. Lucas held him tighter, his chin resting on Daniel's cold, damp hair. He could feel every muscle in Daniel's back, taut and unyielding. He wrapped his arms around Daniel's waist, pulling him flush against his own body, trying to transfer his warmth, his stability, his very presence, into the trembling form beside him. He felt Daniel's breath, ragged and shallow, against his neck. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Daniel's resistance began to falter. The violent shivers softened into a more manageable tremor. His breathing, though still uneven, lost some of its frantic edge. Lucas could feel the subtle shift as Daniel, without conscious thought, began to lean into the embrace. His head, heavy with exhaustion and fear, settled against Lucas's shoulder. One of Daniel's hands, which had been clenched into a tight fist, uncurled and found purchase on Lucas's bicep, a hesitant, almost tentative grip. The hug lingered. It wasn't just a comfort anymore, it was something else, something new. Lucas felt the steady rhythm of Daniel's heartbeat against his own chest, a fragile echo of life in the aftermath of trauma. He could smell the faint scent of stale sweat and something else, something distinctly Daniel, a mix of pine and something earthy, something that had been absent for far too long. He breathed in, deeply, and held it, as if trying to infuse Daniel with his own calm. Time stretched, suspended in the dark. The wind still howled outside, but inside their small bed, a different kind of quiet had settled. It was a silence filled with unspoken emotions, with the weight of shared experience and a burgeoning intimacy that transcended the boundaries of their long-held friendship. Lucas felt Daniel's grip on his arm tighten fractionally, a silent acknowledgement of the comfort, the safety, the profound relief he was finding. Lucas held him, feeling the steady rise and fall of Daniel's chest, a deep, shared breath that seemed to pull them even closer. It was more than just physical warmth. It was an emotional tether, a silent understanding passing between them. Lucas was no longer just his best friend, his anchor. He was a refuge, a silent sanctuary in the chaotic storm of Daniel's mind. And in that moment, as Daniel's body finally relaxed against his, Lucas felt a profound shift, an undeniable deepening of their connection, a quiet blossoming of something he hadn't dared to name. The hug, meant to be a transient comfort, had become a profound statement, a new beginning. Intertwined hands. The days that followed blurred into a routine shaped by Daniel's dependency. He now leaned on Lucas for nearly everything, from morning attire to dinner choices. This wasn't a demanding reliance, but a quiet, almost tentative seeking of assurance. Lucas found himself attuned to Daniel's subtle cues. The slight head tilt when uncertain, his eyes tracking Lucas across a room. These small acts of trust, far from feeling burdensome, cemented Lucas's role as Daniel's anchor. He discovered a peculiar comfort in being so completely needed, a profound sense of purpose he hadn't realised he lacked. One afternoon, Lucas was in the kitchen, attempting to infuse some life into a bland chicken dish, when a choked gasp shattered the apartment's quiet. He spun around, heart lurching, to find Daniel pressed against the living room wall, knuckles stark white on the moulding. His breath hitched, shallow and fast, as his wide, unseeing eyes darted around the room, as if confronting an invisible menace. A low, guttural sound, a blend of a sob and a growl, escaped his throat. "Daniel!" Lucas rushed to him, his own breath catching. "Hey, look at me. It's Lucas. You're safe." Daniel remained unresponsive, his body rigid, trembling violently. His gaze fixed on a horror only he could perceive, unfolding within his mind. Lucas reached out, his hand hovering, uncertain where to touch without further startling him. He recalled the doctor's advice on grounding techniques, on drawing Daniel back to the present. "Daniel, can you hear me?" Lucas's voice was steady, even as his own fear gnawed at him. "Focus on my voice. You're here, with me, in the apartment." He slowly extended his palm, an open invitation. Daniel's unfocused, distant eyes flickered towards it, then back to his unseen tormentor. His lower lip quivered, and a fresh wave of tremors racked his frame. Lucas took another cautious step, his heart hammering a desperate rhythm against his ribs. He saw the sweat beading on Daniel's forehead, the sheen of unshed tears in his bloodshot eyes. "Take my hand, Daniel," Lucas urged, his voice soft but firm. "Just take my hand." After an eternity, Daniel's arm slowly, painfully lifted. His fingers, trembling violently, reached out, fumbling in the air before finally brushing against Lucas's. The instant their skin met, an electric jolt, profound and searing, shot through Lucas. Shot. Daniel's grip was bone-crushing, desperate, his fingers entwining with Lucas's as if attempting to fuse their very beings. The warmth that spread through Lucas was immediate and intense, radiating from their clasped hands, up his arm, and blossoming in his chest. It wasn't merely the heat of Daniel's skin, but something deeper, an acknowledgement, a silent recognition. He felt Daniel's raw terror, his desperate need, channeled directly into him through that intertwined grip. In that moment, a new awareness bloomed within Lucas, a startling clarity that pushed past the boundaries of friendship. He felt a fierce protectiveness, yes, but also a tender yearning that felt undeniably personal. His anticipation of Daniel's touch, once a subconscious hum, now resonated with a distinct vibration, a promise of something more, something sacred. He squeezed Daniel's hand back, a silent vow. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you." Slowly, imperceptibly at first, Daniel's rigid posture began to relent. The wildness in his eyes subsided, replaced by a flicker of recognition. He still trembled, but the violent shaking had lessened. His gaze, still clouded, began to focus on Lucas's face, searching, clinging. Lucas held his gaze, pouring every ounce of reassurance he possessed into that locked connection. He didn't release Daniel's hand. Couldn't. It felt like the very tether holding Daniel to reality and to Lucas himself. Awkward awakenings. A sliver of pale sunlight pierced the curtains, painting a dusty stripe across the floor as Daniel's eyes fluttered open. A lingering hum of sleep resonated through him. For a fleeting moment, he drifted in a blissful, unthinking state, a comforting warmth radiating nearby, a gentle weight cradling his side. The familiar scent of laundry detergent mingled with Lucas's unique aroma, clean, subtly earthy. Then full awareness hit. His head rested on Lucas's shoulder, the rhythmic rise and fall of Lucas's chest, a soft serenade. Their legs were entwined, Lucas's thigh a solid, immovable anchor beneath his own, knees almost locking. One of Lucas's arms lay draped over Daniel's waist, loosely possessive, fingers resting just above his hip. Daniel's own arm was trapped beneath Lucas's weight, his hand curled into a fist between their chests, near Lucas's chin. The jolt wasn't physical, but an electric surge of confusion, a cold dread coiling in his gut. This wasn't right. Friends didn't sleep like this. His breath caught, a silent internal gasp. Lucas's soft cotton t-shirt against his cheek, the faint pulse he felt thrumming beneath the skin, suddenly felt too intimate, too close. Lucas's body heat permeated his own, a strange, almost unsettling merging of boundaries. A flush rose in Daniel's face, a blush he prayed Lucas wouldn't feel through the fabric. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could rewind the last few seconds, wishing he could wake up in his own bed. Alone. The previous night, fragmented and hazy with the lingering terror of a panic attack, began to coalesce. Lucas's steady voice, his strong hands, the way he'd held Daniel close, whispering reassurances as Daniel trembled, convinced the walls were closing in, the ceiling caving. He remembered clinging to Lucas, desperate for an anchor, for anything to ground him. He recalled the immense relief, the overwhelming sense of safety that had washed over him as Lucas's arms tightened. But this was different. This was the stark light of morning, stripping away the urgency of fear and revealing the raw reality of their shared intimacy. Carefully, meticulously, Daniel began to disentangle himself. He held his breath, every movement precise and slow, acutely aware of Lucas's steady breathing, not wanting to disturb him. First he tried to slide his arm from beneath Lucas. It was stuck, slightly numb. He tried again, a tiny, almost imperceptible tug. Lucas shifted slightly, a soft sigh escaping his lips, and Daniel froze, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. When Lucas remained asleep, Daniel continued his careful extraction. He managed to free his arm, a pins and needles sensation shooting through his hand. Next, his legs. He nudged his knee away from Lucas's, then slowly, inch by painful inch, straightened his leg, creating a sliver of space. The warmth that had been so comforting a moment ago now felt stifling, oppressive. Finally, with a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle, Daniel lifted his head from Lucas's shoulder. He propped himself on an elbow, turning to look at Lucas. Lucas's face was soft in sleep, relaxed, a faint stubble shadowing his jaw. He looked so peaceful, so unaware of the turmoil churning within Daniel. A strange mix of guilt and something else, something akin to tenderness, quickly suppressed, tightened Daniel's chest. He had to escape. He had to create more distance, both physical and emotional. This was a line, and he had definitely overstepped it. The thought of confronting Lucas, of explaining this awkward intimacy, made his stomach clench. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to articulate the sudden shame blooming in his chest. With another quiet, deliberate movement, Daniel slid off the bed, his bare feet landing silently on the cool wooden floor. He didn't dare look back, didn't dare risk waking Lucas. He just needed to put space between them, to let the morning air clear his head, to figure out what had just happened. The air in the room, which had felt so thick with Lucas's presence, now felt cold and empty around him. A need for space. The lingering scent of Lucas's skin, a clean, familiar comfort, clung to Daniel even after he'd untangled himself from the sheets, a phantom embrace tightening the knot in his gut. He dressed in a blur, fumbling with buttons, the apartment's silence amplifying the frantic drumbeat in his chest. Lucas slept on, a picture of profound peace, utterly unaware of the seismic shift that had just upended Daniel's world. The sight of that tranquil face, the slight parting of lips, the dark sweep of lashes against his cheek, ignited a fresh spasm of guilt. How could he possibly leave? Yet how could he stay? He found Lucas in the kitchen, engaged in their usual morning ritual of brewing coffee. Usually the aroma filled Daniel with quiet contentment. Today the steam from the mug felt like a funereal shroud. I need to go back to my place, Daniel managed, the words raw and brittle, catching in his throat. He couldn't meet Lucas's gaze, fixating instead on a solitary crumb on the countertop. I need independence. The word felt hollow, a flimsy shield against an unspoken truth. Lucas froze, the spoon clinking against the ceramic before he slowly set it down. Independence. His voice was a quiet current of immediate, unvarnished hurt. You've been here for weeks, Daniel. What changed? Nothing changed, Daniel lied, his voice strained, a tremor he hoped Lucas wouldn't notice. It's just Time. I need to reclaim my own routine, my own space. He finally risked a glance. Lucas's face was a carefully constructed mask, betraying nothing but a faint tension around his jawline. A deep ache intensified in Daniel's chest. He was wounding Lucas, and it tore him apart, but remaining felt like an even greater betrayal of himself. Lucas didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke volumes. "Okay," he said, his voice flat, drained of all emotion. "Whatever you need." The drive back to his own apartment felt like a retreat, a full surrender. The familiar worn armchair, the stacks of unopened mail, the quiet dust motes dancing in the morning light. It all felt alien, unwelcoming. The comfort once synonymous with his own space was now an empty echo. He missed the low thrum of Lucas's presence, the quiet rustle of him moving around, the perfect coffee Lucas made. The ache deepened, a hollowed space where a constant, comforting weight had been. For Lucas, the apartment had become vast, oppressively silent. He kept anticipating the shower's rush or Daniel's off-key humming from the living room. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every empty corner magnified. He tried to busy himself, cleaning, reorganizing, anything to fill the void, but Daniel's absence was a palpable entity, heavy and suffocating. He found himself staring at the sofa cushion where Daniel usually sat, a phantom imprint of his friend's form. The ache in his chest was a constant throb. A quiet lament for the easy intimacy he hadn't realized had become his lifeline. Later that afternoon, his phone buzzed. It was Aunt Carol. "Lucas, honey." Her voice, warm and laced with concern, instantly cut through the haze of his sadness. "Everything all right? You sound quiet." Lucas managed a weak chuckle. "Just a long day, Aunt Carol. Don't you try to fool your old aunt," she said gently, but with a knowing edge. "I can hear it in your voice. Is Daniel doing okay?" Lucas hesitated. He moved back to his apartment this morning." A beat of silence stretched between them. "Ah," Aunt Carol finally said, her voice softening. "I see. And how are you doing with that, Lucas?" The question caught Lucas off guard. He hadn't truly considered his own feelings beyond the immediate, sharp pang of loss. I don't know, Aunt Carol. It's just strange. He was here so long." "Sometimes people need space, Lucas, even from the ones they're closest to," she offered, her tone thoughtful. "Doesn't mean they don't care. It just means they're figuring things out. And sometimes, Lucas, when someone's been through a lot, they need to figure things out on their own terms, in their own time." She paused, then added, "But you, my dear boy, you've been a rock for him. Don't you forget that. And don't you let his need for space make you forget your own worth." Her words were a balm, a gentle reminder that his feelings, his sadness, were valid. But they didn't erase the emptiness that now permeated his home, or the gnawing worry for Daniel, alone in his apartment, grappling with whatever had driven him away. Echoes in the dark. The door's decisive click echoed not just through the apartment's sparse rooms, but resonated deep within Daniel. He lingered in the entryway, the oppressive quiet a stark contrast to Lucas's familiar hum. The murmur of his television, the comforting scent of coffee, the undeniable presence. He'd convinced himself he yearned for this autonomy, yet now it felt less like liberation and more like a cavernous emptiness. His duffel bag hit the floor with a dull thud, a fleeting rupture in the silence that instantly resettled, denser, heavier than before. The apartment mirrored his departure, meticulously clean, sterile, utterly devoid of comfort. Dust motes danced in the solitary sunbeam, spotlighting forgotten nooks, unread spines, the life he'd never truly inhabited here since before. Before the desert, the screams. Before Lucas. He moved to the window, his gaze sweeping over the urban sprawl without truly registering it. His reflection, gaunt and shadowed, stared back, a stranger in his own domain. He attempted to busy himself, unpacking the few belongings from Lucas's, arranging them with an almost obsessive precision. Each folded shirt, each carefully placed book was a desperate act to fill the void, to reconstruct a fragile semblance of normalcy. But the silence persisted, a low, constant thrum beneath his skin. Days bled into a monotonous cycle of forced isolation. He forced himself to eat, but each mouthful tasted like ash. He walked aimlessly through the park, averting gazes, the innocent laughter of children grating on his frayed nerves. He read, but the words swam, refusing to coalesce into meaning. He pushed his body to exhaustion, hoping to quell the insistent whispers in his mind, yet they only intensified, growing more menacing in the subsequent quiet. The nights, however, were his undoing. The first night alone, he lay rigid in bed, the darkness a suffocating shroud. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, morphed into the sounds of battle. He squeezed his eyes shut, desperate to conjure Lucas's scent, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the reassuring weight of his hand. But only cold, empty air surrounded him, and the increasingly vivid replay of splintered glass and strangled cries. He jolted awake with a sharp gasp, sheets tangled, sweat plastering his hair, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. The room spun, walls closing in, and he scrambled from the bed, gasping for air that wouldn't come. He braced himself against the wall, trying to anchor himself, but his hands trembled, his knees threatening to buckle. He was back there, in the dust, the chaos, the deafening roar. He slid to the floor, pulling his knees to his chest, his breath coming in ragged, desperate sobs. This was worse, far, far worse than anything he'd endured at Lucas's. There, even in the throes of a nightmare, a part of him sensed Lucas's proximity, a lighthouse in the storm. Here there was only darkness, and the terrifying echo of his own fear. Night after night, the attacks intensified, becoming more brutal. Sleep became a treacherous terrain he dreaded entering. His body ached from perpetual tension, his mind a whirlwind of fragmented images and deafening noise. He would pace the apartment until dawn, driven by a primal need to ward off the nightmares, to outrun the demons born of his own making. The apartment, once a symbol of his desired independence, had become a self-designed cage. He stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, the gaunt face now bearing a dark, hollowed eyes, a haunted, desperate expression. He ran a trembling hand over his stubbled jaw. He hadn't shaved in days, hadn't eaten a proper meal, hadn't known a moment of genuine peace since leaving Lucas. Guilt gnawed at him, a festering wound beneath the panic. Guilt for leaving, for hurting Lucas, for the unspoken truth that had driven him away, a truth that now mocked him in his solitude. One particularly brutal night, after an attack left him gasping for breath, on the cold kitchen floor, he lay shivering as the first tendrils of dawn painted the sky. A single, profound realization pierced through the fog of his terror. He couldn't do this, not alone. He couldn't outrun the war, not without the anchor Lucas had unwittingly become. The fierce independence he'd so desperately clung to felt like a cruel joke. He was drowning, and the only hand that could pull him out was the one he'd so foolishly pushed away. A desperate, raw cry escaped his lips, swallowed by the unforgiving silence of his empty home. The trembling call. The digital clock's malevolent glow marked 3:17 a.m. Daniel lay prone, eyes fixed on the lazily rotating ceiling fan, its efforts futile against the room's oppressive heat. Sweat plastered his hair, a phantom scent of cordite and burning flesh. A cruel memento of the nightmare still clung to his awareness, yanking him from sleep. The recurring terror, a constant loop or subtle variation. The dust, the shouts, the metallic tang of his own fear. Since leaving Lucas's apartment, he'd exhausted every remedy. Sleeping pills that left him groggy but haunted, punishing runs until his muscles screamed, even cheap whiskey that only sharpened the edges of his dread. Nothing quelled the echoes. His gaze drifted to his phone, a dark, inert rectangle on the nightstand. A silent, furious war raged within him, pride against desperation. He'd left Lucas, convinced he was a burden, a broken thing destined to drag his friend down. He'd promised himself independence was the key to self-reclamation. What a bitter lie. Autonomy felt like drowning in an ocean of silence, no shore in sight. His hand trembled, reaching for the device, its cool metal a stark contrast to his feverish skin. He flipped it over, the screen's sudden glare a judgment. Lucas's name, nestled under L, shimmered like an impossible beacon. Shame coiled in his gut, thick and hot. To call now, after everything, to admit defeat, felt like tearing open a fresh wound. Yet the alternative was another night wrestling with phantoms, another morning where the simple act of breathing demanded monumental effort. His reflection in the bathroom mirror was a gaunt stranger with hollow eyes and a haunted mask. He was unravelling. His thumb hovered over the contact. Each thrum of his heart beat a frantic rhythm against his ribs, deafening in the silent room. He drew a shaky breath, air catching in his throat. What could he possibly say? I was wrong. I can't do this. The words tasted like ash. With a sudden, decisive movement born of pure, unadulterated terror, he tapped the screen. The phone began to dial, each ring a hammer blow to his fragile composure. He almost hung up, almost capitulated to fear. But then a groggy voice, thick with sleep, answered. Hello? Lucas's voice. A lifeline thrown into a raging sea. Daniel's own voice, when it emerged, was a raspy whisper, barely audible above the ringing in his ears. Lucas? A beat of silence on the other end, then a rustle. Daniel? What's wrong? Are you okay? The sleepiness had vanished, replaced by immediate, searing concern that cleaved through Daniel's defences like a hot blade. No, Daniel choked out, the single word a raw admission of utter vulnerability. A full-body tremor ran through him. Hot, unexpected tears pricked his eyes. No, I can't do this any more, Lucas. The words tumbled out, a dam breaking. I keep seeing things. I can't sleep. I'm scared. He trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his terror, the suffocating loneliness. Another pause, shorter this time, filled with the sound of Lucas's rapid breathing. Where are you? What's your address? The command was firm, brooking no argument. My apartment, Daniel managed, giving the address of his new place, the one Lucas had never seen. Stay put. Don't move. I'm coming. The line clicked. Dead. Daniel lowered the phone, his hand still shaking. The apartment's silence now felt different, imbued with a strange, nascent hope. He was still terrified, still trembling, but a tiny, fragile spark had ignited within him. Lucas was coming. He was actually coming. He squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear tracing a path through the sweat on his temple. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't feel entirely alone. Safe in your arms. The miles unspooled beneath Lucas's tires, each one an eternity. His knuckles, white against the steering wheel, mirrored the frantic drum of his heart in the truck's suffocating silence. Daniel's raw, choked sobs still clawed at his composure, a desperate sound that had shredded Lucas's carefully constructed calm. He pressed the accelerator, the needle climbing past the speed limit, his sole imperative reaching Daniel. When the truck finally crunched to a halt outside Daniel's isolated cabin, the world was a canvas of inky black, pierced only by a distant moon's anemic glow. No welcoming light spilled from the windows. The small structure was swallowed by an unsettling darkness. A cold knot of dread tightened in Lucas's gut. He cut the engine, plunging the night into a sudden, deafening quiet, and hurried out, his boots grinding on the gravel path. "Daniel," he called, his voice a thin thread of barely suppressed panic. The front door stood ajar, a silent invitation, or perhaps a testament to Daniel's disoriented state. Lucas nudged it open, stepping into a suffocating void. The air inside was heavy and stale, thick with unwashed clothes and a sharp metallic tang that pricked Lucas's senses. He fumbled for a light switch, his hand finding only emptiness. "Daniel, where are you?" He tried again, softer this time, gentler, navigating the unfamiliar space by instinct. The living room was a labyrinth of shadowy furniture. A faint whimper, barely audible, pulled him deeper into the gloom. He followed the sound, his eyes slowly piercing the profound darkness, until he discerned a huddled form in the corner of the sofa, tucked against the armrest, almost absorbed by the shadows. "Daniel," Lucas whispered, his heart aching. Daniel was curled in a fetal position, knees drawn to his chest, face buried in his arms. Even in the near total darkness, the soft sheen on his cheeks betrayed the wetness of tears. His body trembled with silent, gut-wrenching sobs that shook him from head to toe. Lucas sank to his knees beside the sofa, reaching out a hesitant hand. "Hey, it's me. I'm here." At Lucas's voice, Daniel flinched, then slowly, tentatively, lifted his head. His eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, held a terror that clawed at Lucas's soul. Fresh tears carved pathways through the grime on Daniel's face. He looked utterly broken, a shattered echo of the man Lucas knew, and the sight was a punch to the gut. "Lucas!" Daniel choked out, his voice raw, barely a whisper. The single word was a plea, a confession, a desperate surrender. Without a second thought, Lucas reached for him, pulling Daniel into his arms. Daniel offered no resistance, collapsing against Lucas's chest with a shuddering sigh that seemed to release a lifetime of pent-up pain. Lucas held him tightly, one hand cradling Daniel's head, the other wrapped around his waist, pulling him closer until no space remained between them. Daniel clung with a ferocity bordering on desperation, his fingers digging into Lucas's shirt, his body racked with silent sobs that resonated through Lucas's own chest. Lucas felt the wetness of Daniel's tears soaking through his shirt, but he didn't care. He held on, rocking them gently, murmuring soft reassurances into Daniel's hair. "It's okay. You're safe. I've got you." Lucas felt his own eyes welling, tears stinging as he buried his face in Daniel's hair, inhaling the faint, familiar scent that always brought him comfort. He let them fall, hot and heavy, mingling with Daniel's. It was a shared grief, a release of all the unspoken fears and anxieties that had plagued them both. This wasn't just about Daniel's pain. It was about Lucas's terror of losing him, of watching him shatter beyond repair. Slowly, Daniel's sobs subsided, replaced by shuddering breaths. He finally pulled back, just enough to look up, his tear-streaked face illuminated by the faint ambient light filtering through the window. His eyes, still glistening, met Lucas's. In their depths, Lucas saw not just his own reflection, but a profound vulnerability, a naked trust that stole his breath. He saw his safe harbour, his anchor in the storm. He saw his everything. "Don't leave me," Daniel whispered, his voice hoarse, his gaze unwavering, a silent plea that echoed the depth of his need. Lucas tightened his hold, pulling Daniel closer once more. "Never," he vowed, the word a promise etched into the very core of his being. He would never leave. Not now. Not ever. A new beginning. The word never hung in the air, a sacred promise whispered between them, sealing a bond forged in shared fear and desperate hope. Lucas felt Daniel's grip loosen slightly, the frantic trembling subsiding into a shaky calm. He pulled back, just enough to look at him, his thumb stroking the damp skin of Daniel's cheekbone. Daniel's eyes, still red-rimmed and swollen, met his, a raw vulnerability shining through the lingering terror. There was a question in those depths, a hesitant wonder that mirrored the tremor in Lucas's own heart. Slowly, carefully, Lucas cupped Daniel's face in both hands. The stubble on Daniel's jaw tickled his palms, a grounding sensation amidst the storm of emotions. Daniel leaned into the touch, his eyes never leaving Lucas's. The air in the small cabin crackled with unspoken truths, with years of unspoken affection and burgeoning desire finally finding a voice. Lucas saw a flicker of apprehension in Daniel's gaze, a ghost of the fear that had driven him away, but it was quickly overshadowed by something else, a profound weariness, a desperate yearning for solace. Lucas lowered his head, his gaze unwavering, a silent question in his own eyes. Daniel's breath hitched, a soft, almost imperceptible sound in the quiet room. Lucas felt the subtle shift in Daniel's posture, a gentle leaning in, an invitation. He closed the remaining distance, his lips brushing against Daniel's. It was soft, tentative, a breath of a kiss that tasted of salt and tears and the profound relief of finally coming home. There was no rush, no urgency, just a delicate exploration, a slow unfurling of years of suppressed feelings. Daniel's hand rose, trembling slightly, to cup the back of Lucas's neck, his fingers tangling in the hair there, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss. It was an affirmation, a surrender, a silent declaration that transcended words. In that moment, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only the gentle press of their lips, the soft sigh that escaped Daniel, and the silent understanding that bloomed between them, fragile yet potent. When they finally broke apart, it was with a shared reluctance, their foreheads resting together, chests heaving in unison. "Stay," Daniel whispered again, his voice hoarse, but this time it was not a plea born of panic, but a quiet request, heavy with meaning. "Always," Lucas murmured back, pressing another soft kiss to Daniel's temple, then his jaw, before resting his chin on Daniel's shoulder. They spent the rest of the night talking, curled together on the worn sofa, the fire in the hearth, casting dancing shadows around them. The initial terror had receded, replaced by a profound intimacy. Daniel spoke in fits and starts, his voice raspy, recounting fragments of his time in isolation, the crushing weight of loneliness, the way the silence had amplified the echoes of his past, the relentless assault of his memories. Lucas listened, his arms wrapped around Daniel, offering a steady anchor. He didn't interrupt, simply absorbed Daniel's pain, his silent presence a balm. And then Lucas spoke too, not of his own fears for Daniel, not of the gnawing worry that had consumed him, but of the loneliness he'd felt in Daniel's absence, the hollow ache in his own life. He admitted how terrifying it had been to watch Daniel pull away, to see the light in his eyes dim, to feel their connection fraying. He spoke of his confusion, his frustration, his desperate longing for Daniel to just talk to him. Daniel listened, his head resting against Lucas's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a counterpoint to the turbulent symphony of his own emotions. As dawn approached, painting the sky with hues of bruised purple and soft orange, Daniel turned in Lucas's arms, his gaze soft. "I was so scared," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "Scared of what this meant. Scared of losing you, because I thought I was ruining things." Lucas's fingers traced the line of Daniel's jaw. "You could never ruin us, Daniel. Never." He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to Daniel's forehead. "We're just figuring things out. Together." A faint smile touched Daniel's lips. A genuine smile, the first Lucas had seen in weeks. It was fragile, but it was there. A promise of healing. A beacon of a new beginning. They had faced the darkness, confronted the unspoken, and in doing so had found a light that promised to guide them through whatever came next. The healing together. The first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, painting stripes across the rumpled sheets and Daniel's bare shoulder. Lucas stirred, a soft sigh escaping him as he registered the weight of Daniel's arm draped possessively across his waist, the steady rhythm of his breathing a lullaby against his back. It was a new kind of peace, different from the guarded comfort they'd found before. This was a quiet certainty, a promise whispered in the darkness and sealed with a kiss that still tingled on his lips. Turning gently, Lucas propped himself on an elbow, his gaze tracing the soft curve of Daniel's jaw, the faint stubble, the relaxed lines around his eyes. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Daniel looked truly at rest, the shadows of his nightmares momentarily banished. He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from Daniel's forehead. Daniel stirred, his eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes that, even in their sleep-softened state, held a new depth, a nascent understanding. A slow smile spread across Daniel's face, a genuine, unburdened smile that made Lucas's heart ache with a tender joy. "Morning," Daniel murmured, his voice thick with sleep and contentment. He pulled Lucas closer, burying his face in Lucas's neck, the scent of their mingled sleep, of safety, filling Lucas's senses. "Stay." "Always," Lucas whispered back, tightening his embrace. The days that followed were a delicate dance of discovery and rebuilding. They spoke, truly spoke, in a way they never had before. Daniel recounted snippets of his time away, Not the harrowing details of combat, but the crushing weight of loneliness, the fear of losing himself, the struggle to reconcile the person he was with, the soldier he was forced to be. Lucas listened, offering a steady presence, a hand to hold, a shoulder to lean on. He shared his own anxieties, the gnawing fear of Daniel's absence, the despair he'd felt watching his best friend crumble. In their shared vulnerability, their love deepened, becoming an anchor in the turbulent waters of Daniel's past. One afternoon, Daniel found himself staring at the old army boots he'd left by the door, a tremor running through him. Lucas, sensing the shift in his mood, gently placed a hand on his back. "What is it?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. I need to sort through some things. From before. Lucas squeezed his shoulder. "I'm here, whatever you need." It wasn't easy. There were days when Daniel would retreat into himself, the memories too raw, the pain too overwhelming. Lucas learned to recognize the signs, the distant look in Daniel's eyes, the sudden stiffness in his posture, the way he'd pull away from touch. He learned to give Daniel space when he needed it, and to offer quiet comfort when Daniel was ready to emerge. He'd make tea, put on music, or simply sit beside him in companionable silence, his presence a constant, reassuring hum. One evening, a particularly vivid nightmare left Daniel gasping and shaking in Lucas's arms. Tears streamed down his face, a mixture of terror and shame. Lucas held him close, stroking his hair, whispering words of reassurance until the tremors subsided. "It's okay, Dan. You're safe. I've got you." Daniel clung to him, his voice ragged. I don't know if I'll ever be okay, Lucas. What if I can't get past this?" Lucas tilted Daniel's chin up, meeting his tear-filled gaze. "We'll get through it, together. You don't have to be okay all at once. Just keep trying. Keep talking to me. We'll figure it out." And they did. Slowly, painstakingly, Daniel began to mend. He started seeing a therapist Lucas had found, a gentle woman who specialized in trauma. He began to find solace in small routines, morning walks with Lucas, cooking together, reading quietly in the evenings. The panic attacks lessened in frequency, and the nightmares, while still present, became less debilitating. Their connection, forged in the crucible of fear and vulnerability, blossomed into something profound and enduring. They found strength in their shared moments of laughter, in the tender touch of a hand, in the silent understanding that passed between them. Lucas, who had always been the steady rock, found himself leaning on Daniel too, drawing strength from Daniel's resilience, from the unwavering love that now flowed between them. They were building something new, a future where healing wasn't a solitary burden, but a shared journey, navigated hand in hand, heart to heart. Each sunrise brought a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet affirmation that even in the aftermath of darkness, love could and would find a way to bloom.